Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Persevering in the Face of Book Challenges. I'm Heather Booth. I'm a librarian and the audio editor at Booklist. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this very special event and for supporting inclusive reading. Before we begin, I'd like to direct you all to the Unite Against Book Bans website, where you can find resources that will help you raise awareness about and combat censorship, including downloadable graphics, talking points, contact information for local officials, grassroots organizing guides, and lots more. A link to this website was shared in the reminder email, and it'll also be sent to you after the webinar to all registrants. If you'd like to visit the site at any time during the presentation, just ask for the URL in the Q&A box, and one of our Booklist staff members will be happy to send it along. I'd like to go over some technical details. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you might have. On the bottom of your screen, there's a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or if you need technical assistance, just click the Q&A, type your message into the box that appears, and we'll do our best to respond to all tech-related questions. And we'll pass along all other questions to today's panelists so they can follow up with you after the webinar. Also, Booklist offers closed captioning on all of our webinars. So to enable or disable captions on your screen, just look for and click the live transcript icon on the toolbar that I just mentioned. From there, you can select show or hide subtitles on the menu that appears. If you choose to enable subtitles, you can adjust the size of the captions at any time by selecting subtitle settings. We have a wonderful discussion planned for today. Whether you're joining us from a library that is experiencing book challenges, have yourself sought to defend books in your collection, or are simply aware of the increase in assaults on the freedom to read, we hope this conversation is useful to you and helps bolster you for the very important work that you're doing in your community. Let's meet our panelists. Cindy Hohl is the Director of Policy Analysis and Operational Support at the Kansas City Public Library. She also serves as the Treasurer of the Freedom to Read Foundation, an affiliate of the American Library Association. Cindy is passionate about advocating for everyone to receive equal access to information and upholding First Amendment rights through the work with the Missouri Library Association on the Intellectual Freedom Committee. As rising book challenges and misinformation abound, there has never been a better time to be a librarian to help everyone access accurate information from credible sources. Cindy holds a Master's of Business Administration degree from Baker University and a Master of Library and Information Sciences degree from Wayne State University. Next, we have Shelley McNerney. She has been in education since 1999, first as a secondary English teacher, reading teacher, and literacy coach. 12 years ago, she made the switch to her dream job, becoming a high school librarian. During her time as a librarian, she's been privileged to serve on a number of ALA Book Award committees, including Best Fiction for Young Adults, Quick Picks for Reluctant Young Adult Readers, the William C. Morris Award, and the Michael L. Prince Award. Another personal and professional career highlight was writing YA reviews for Kirkus. All of these activities are largely made possible by her patient husband, Charlie, who serves as the chief and all-around happiness engineer who keeps life running while she's deeply immersed in various YA books. And finally, we have Gavin Downing, who has been a teacher librarian for over 8 years. Last year, his principal led an effort to remove multiple LGBTQ+ books from his middle school library, claiming they were obscene. He fought back, eventually ending up before the school board, who narrowly voted to keep the books in the library. He won the Candace Morgan Intellectual Freedom Award from the Washington Library Association this year and has now been elected to the WLA's Intellectual Freedom section. Thank you all so much for being here. Let's dive in.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you all so much. So I was hoping you could, we just heard a little introduction. If you'd like to add on to your introduction, if you could tell us a little bit about your library, your community, and if you can start on a positive note, if you could share with us what brought you to librarianship. And I'll go in the order that I see on the screen. So Shelley, could you start us off?
Sure. So I am in a fairly conservative community. I'm the sole library staff member in a high school of about 2,000 students. I taught English for a number of years and I switched schools a number of times, and every single school librarian would always tell me, you need to be a school librarian. And Reader's Advisory and really trying to help my kids find just the right book. A lot of them had really negative perceptions of themselves as a reader or what reading meant. So trying to combat that was really fun. So I was in a book club with a couple of school librarians, my husband's school librarians actually, and you know how book clubs transition into wine clubs. So I came home after wine club and said like, hey, good news, I'm going back. I'm going to get another master's degree and become a school librarian. And luckily my husband like grinned and bear it and has been super supportive. And it was the best thing I've ever done.
Go ahead, Gavin.
No, I was just going to say what brought me into librarianship. It actually was my spouse. My wife is also a librarian. She got her master's in library science after we were married. She took it online with Texas Women University, and I just sort of sat in on those classes. I was already a teacher at that point. Since they were all online, I was able to do that and learn so much. I'm like, that's awesome. I should move into the school library. And so I got my master's at that point, got the endorsement in library, and that's what brought me here.
Excellent. Cindy.
Well, Gavin, you stole my story. My husband, Nathan, is a librarian. He's a second generation. His mom was a librarian, and he works at the Johnson County Public Library System on the Kansas side. So I am downtown at the Kansas City Public in Missouri, and we serve an urban community. We are an award-winning system, and I absolutely love the work that we do each and every day. And to say I'm passionate about this environment is rather an understatement. So I look forward to this discussion today.
Thank you all so much. So can you each share a story of a book challenge that you've experienced in brief? I know these stories can get real long, but if we can just kind of get the basic outline of something that you've experienced relating to book challenges, how it played out and how it resolved.
I'll start. So it was last December. My principal came into my library carrying the book Jack of Hearts and Other Parts by Elsie Rosen. It was one that I had carefully curated to make sure that I thought it was appropriate for some of my 8th graders at my middle school. It wasn't something I was going to throw out there as required reading or anything like that, but for those who would need it, I thought it would be a very important one. She was absolutely scandalized. She read one page out of context, was completely scandalized by it. And I asked her, I told her, look, there is a challenge process if you want to follow that process, but I would ask that you read it first. And she told me, well, I'll read it, but if I don't like it, this book's not going to be on the shelf. And it escalated from there. She started to pull other books from the library. She started calling other principals in the district saying they should start pulling books from their library as well. And I was trying to say, no, that's not the process. You have to follow the process. She said, I'm the principal. I don't have to follow that. And the district was backing her. I got the union involved, but it wasn't until we went public and went to the media about it. Kelly Jensen did a fantastic article in Book Riot about what happened, what was happening at the time. And that put enough pressure on that suddenly the district started backpedaling and started actually following its proper protocols. The challenges at that point, there were 3 books that she had picked so far. And so the other 2 were If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo, and the third was All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. And so these 3 books were quietly returned to the shelves. The district said, well, the books are on the shelves while the process goes on. And when I showed that, look, the process has not been followed at all, they dropped them except for one of them, a community member who did not have kids at our school, may have worked with my principal in the past potentially, immediately followed, issued a new challenge within half an hour of that decision. And it was just for Jack of Hearts. That went through the proper protocols mostly, and it eventually ended up before the school board last June. So this lasted over 6 months. And during that time, my principal was very unfortunate. My work became really a nightmare position. But in the end, we persevered.
Thank you. Shelley, do you want to share your story?
Yeah, so mine isn't one that I personally experienced because it happened in the mid-90s, but a lot of people might remember it. It's a case that gets studied in library school. So I am part of the Olathe School District. And in the early to mid-90s, they pulled the book Annie on My Mind, which was an LGBTQ title. And they were eventually sued for having done that. And when you read the testimony of the school board members and the administrators involved in it, it's shocking what they were willing to say out loud about their personal beliefs. So they were eventually, to make a long story short, found to have violated their own reconsideration policy, and that they were making these judgments based on personal beliefs. And so the book was returned to the shelf, which you would think would be a win for First Amendment. But the district right away was like, well, we're going to come up with some policies so this doesn't happen again. And so I think they really worked to create a policy that would allow for censorship to happen before the books get added to the collection, as if the problem was removing the book. And so, great, we just will make sure we won't add books like that ever again, and then we won't have an issue. And even though we've moved socially forward a lot since the mid-90s, our selection policy and reconsideration policy really has not. So we haven't had many, if any, formal challenges that I know of, but we have a lot of soft censorship happening, if you can even call that a thing. Librarians who just are encouraged not to make certain titles available through the collection, or are, if you do add one to the collection, just please don't promote it. Just leave it there quietly and let's see what happens. So ours is really, I think, just a story of a district that is still reeling with an atmosphere that's focused on limited collection development.
Thank you, Cindy.
So I'm Dakota of the Santee Sioux Nation, and as past president of the American Indian Library Association, you know, of course, we hear a lot about Sherman Alexie and that title being challenged, you know, for a long time now. The absolutely true Diary of a Part-Time Indian, that narrative is beautiful in my eyes. When you read about one's culture, you get to see a little bit more about how they experience life. And so why should any one reader have the ability to say, that's not a true story? That narrative doesn't have a place in our community, in this library, in my home. Of course, everyone has that right to choose which story they want to hold on to. But to negate that storyline and say to an entire group of people, that doesn't really matter in this society, in this community. No one should have the right to do that. And so when you look at these titles and the reasons that people express their disinterest, that's good information to know. Luckily, we have collections that are quite diverse and expansive. And if we don't have a title, hopefully we can get one through interlibrary loan. But it's really challenging when we have people who are already marginalized and who represent a very small demographic of the community be told, your story doesn't have value and it shouldn't belong in this library.
Thank you so much for that point. We're going to talk a little bit later about the impact specifically on marginalized communities. And so I just want to be sure we get back to that. But I'm hoping everybody can talk a little bit about how this climate of book challenges or the fear of book challenges has impacted your work on a day-to-day basis. Gavin, I think it's a lot has changed for you. I wondered if you could start us off with this one.
Yeah. So I knew when I ordered Jack of Hearts that it would upset some people. When I was looking at it and curating it for the collection, one of my thoughts looking at it was someone's someone's going to, be upset about this book. But when I looked at everything else, that wasn't a reason to exclude it from the library. I can't put any weight on whether or not someone's going to be upset about it. Everything else supported its inclusion in the library. And so I went ahead and did that. And I try to be mindful of that even now when I look at, now I'm at a high school now, at a new school, and I just ordered Genderqueer, which of course is one of the most banned books in America, and challenged books in America right now. But it is such an important book. It's one that the GSA here at my school is excited to be able to check out from the library and read. And, the GSA is a small percentage of the overall LGBTQ community. These are the ones who are actually comfortable with being out about it. And a lot of these kids are probably not there yet, even if they are within that community. They're still figuring things out, and this book would be able to help with that. And I knew when I ordered it, someone's going to be upset, but I can't let that change what my students need. But it's a conscious choice. And I've spoken with other librarians who are engaging in that soft censorship to try to protect themselves and protect their library. And I get it. I understand why, because I've been on that end of what happens, and I can't. It's sad. It makes me sad for the situation. I don't blame any librarian who makes that call, but I really hope they choose differently, that they do choose for the students, not for what's not going to make waves.
Shelley, can you talk about how this climate is changing your work environment?
Yeah, I would second everything that Gavin is talking about. I had an internal discussion with my fellow high school librarians about Jack of Hearts, and I was strongly in favor of why it was appropriate for our collections. Someone with leadership above me actually said to me, well, Shelley, I guess there's no line you won't cross. And I thought like, oh, well, okay, then that's my role now. Okay, that's fine. I had to get comfortable with that. But I would say titles that I would have added in the past without really worrying about it, because I would have thought that this is the right thing to do for my student population. Now I still order them, but I'm nervous about it. And I will have conversations with my husband. Okay, is this like the one to die on? Is this the one that I'm going to be called a pedophile, or like my job will be at risk? And I have conversations with fellow librarians. And one thing that I realize now that I try to have almost like a challenge ready set of resources for those titles. I really have to think about how am I prepared to talk about these? And that's not something I would have done in the past. So I can definitely feel that it influences just my level of apprehension, even if it doesn't change my actual purchasing. But I would say that I can feel that it definitely has influenced what I put on display and definitely what I book talk to my classes. And I have to admit, in the last month or so, I've started getting really frustrated with myself about that. And so I'm just about to like blow it up and have like a whole display. And as I was writing my notes, I thought, oh, I better talk to my little censorship support group of librarians before I do this. But it's that hide the pride. There's the fear factor though, that like, if I have the books and I don't really promote them, but kids can find them, is it better to have the books or is it better to really widely promote them and then let them get challenged and have everyone find out and then have them get pulled? So, there's that constant, like, what's the best way? But I'm starting to get frustrated and think like, it's just about time to pull the plug and put them all on display. So we'll see what happens.
And on the public library side, we're open from dawn till dusk, 7 days a week in some areas. And we never know what's going to happen during the course of the day. So we need to prepare our staff. We need to make sure that they have access to information that they need when they're in that moment engaging. when they're interacting with patrons, either in person, on the phone, via chat. We need to make sure that everyone understands what the library stands for and that censorship isn't negotiable. So when we're looking at the ALA Bill of Rights, making sure that that's printed off, that staff have access to that. Also the intellectual freedom statement, making sure everyone's trained to understand what that means and what we're here to do. What is the role of the library in our community? It's to provide access to information, accurate information, especially from credible sources. So making sure that staff have everything that they need so that they feel at least a little bit comforted in that moment. But we never know when it's going to happen. No, but nobody does. But we can do our best to prepare everyone to make sure that we are able to respond. And even if we don't have an immediate answer, we can help guide them through the process, showing them where the forms are available, making sure that that's on our website so that the public can access it, making sure we have hard copies for those who are right there. Everyone wants to be heard, and that's really what we're getting to. So making sure that our staff have the tools that they need so that they can be successful in that moment. And for managers, it's really important that they're there on site, able to provide that backup support so that things don't escalate, so that we can help everyone have a successful library service at that moment.
Yeah, so getting ready and just preparation and training staff is so important. One of the quotes that we were sharing earlier was from George M. Johnson, the author of All Boys Aren't Blue, which is a much challenged book at the moment, which his grandmother told him, which is, you don't have to get ready if you stay ready, which is such wise advice. And it's something that I think that a lot of us are doing in our libraries. So talking a little bit more specifically about staff and staff support for patrons and staff and students too in your school libraries who share identities with those authors and topics frequently challenged, it can feel even more personally wounded than just having your concept of intellectual freedom being wounded. What can libraries and managers do to show that they're a safe space for patrons, for fellow staff members, for students who are members of these communities whose voices are being targeted and silenced? Cindy, can you start us with this one?
Sure. So, a lot of us have access to human resources and EAP assistance and services that are available to help staff work through these incidents as they occur. But again, with the planning and making sure that everyone has access to resources at their fingertips and that they've had time to process and think about everything beforehand, that's really essential to their success in the workplace. And so leaders really need to step up and make sure that we aren't putting our staff in situations where they're shouldering all of this and feeling alone. It's very isolating for anyone. It's a stressful situation. No one intends to go into librarianship with the thought of being challenged for the objects that are available. We aren't challenged often on other inanimate objects in the library, yet here we are talking about printed words on paper and the mere offense that some take to that. There are a lot of things you could get offended about. Is that really the librarian's position, is to take in all that feedback? Hopefully you have a customer feedback channel available on your website, comment cards, boxes, make things available. Again, tools and resources are really what's valuable in this moment, because especially as a BIPOC library staff member, it's just salt in the wound. It's hurt upon hurt. And you know what? We didn't go into this work to be subjected to that. So leaders really need to stand up and recognize you might not know exactly how they feel, but you can listen and you can offer that support, because that's the mark of a true leader, is someone who's able to diffuse the situation, listen for understanding, and follow through. And don't just shrug it off. Don't walk away and act like, okay, well, I patted their back, or I helped them out, or I told them they can call the EAP. This is about relationship building. And we want to be that safe and welcoming place for everyone, but especially for our staff, who are our greatest asset by far.
Thank you so much. Shelley, you talked a little bit about support and supporting each other as librarians.
Well, and I think for me, a big part of it is that my population are my students, and how do I help them feel like the library is a welcoming place in a district that in many ways makes it clear that they are not welcoming. We have some pretty problematic gender pronoun name policies that we're following that I would argue make kids feel really bad, and definitely send the message that their identities are not their own. So, I try to do simple things like I have the Glisten safe space stickers around my library. I have one on my desk, on the library doors, in the classroom area of the library. I now actually consciously, when classes come in for the first time, include the fact that a library stands for diversity and what does that mean, and that I personally value diversity, and that you can ask me for any kind of book and I'll offer multiple examples, both LGBTQ and not. I try to include more LGBTQ books in my book talks, though haven't done Jack of Hearts, but it's coming. But so trying to be very explicit in saying to the kids, I'm here for you. I have my pronouns in my email signature line. I have my pronouns on my name tag, so that hopefully that's an indicator for people that like, hey, I understand this. I respect that these are choices that you should be allowed to make. So trying to have things like that to just be an antidote to the messaging that I think that really the gaslighting, there's a lot of us saying that we value all the students, but I think then we have policies in place that don't send that same message. So just trying to be more explicit in it. I don't know if it really hits home with the kids, but that's what I'm trying.
And I think those are all really good things. I do a lot of the same stuff. I actually have on my badge like a P-flag teacher pin. But the other thing I've been doing is, for me, is I've been very proactive in reaching out to, for example, I've attended the GSA clubs a couple of times and specifically said, look, I'm wanting to make sure you feel seen and represented and see the library as a safe space. If you have book recommendations, I have big, QR codes available for students to, give me feedback there. But going specifically to those clubs, I've gone to the Black Student Union Club, all of the various marginalized community clubs. I have gone to try to make sure they know that I am here to make this space safe for them. And that's the one thing I do in addition to the things you've been talking about, which are some great things too, very important. So that's the only thing I would add.
So all of this is work. It's additional work that it's good work that we should all be taking on anyway, but it feels like there's an extra pressure to do this work that might not have existed in 10 years ago. And I feel like burnout, we need to talk about burnout in library work and how this is impacting that. Librarians have always dealt with burnout. I think that as we can talk about vocational awe, we can talk about, these very highly aspirational reasons that we enter librarianship. So the idea of burnout is not new in librarianship, but these book challenges feel different. It feels like they hit in a different way than other crises that we've faced and different other stress-inducing situations that we encounter in libraries. Have you encountered that feeling with yourself and your colleagues, and how do you respond to moving through the burnout, or I hate to use the term self-care because I think that gets kind of flippantly thrown around a lot, but how have you managed that feeling of impending burnout or pulling back or pushing through it during this time? Gavin, can you start with that one?
Yeah. I will say I saw a therapist for those 6 months. Absolutely. I was ready for a challenge. As I said, my wife sort of got me started on the path. Although I think that was early. I don't know if it was during this part of or not, but no, my wife got me started on the path of becoming a librarian. And back then in 2008, we were discussing what we would do when a book challenge came before us. Not as an if, it was a when, because if we're doing our jobs right, eventually you're going to get some. We were not prepared for it to come from my own administration, but so that took me by surprise. But otherwise, I was able to hit the ground running because I was ready to go. I had so much support from the community, but even still, it took up my entire life for 6 months. I didn't really see my friends for the most part. They were supportive. They were cheering me on, but you know, I usually get together and play role-playing games with my friends because I'm a big nerd, and none of that for 6 months. It was just, it was all consuming. And so, yeah, I saw a therapist. And one of the things we talked about at one point was the fact that self-care is something you do once you're out of the fire, but when the room is still burning around you, it doesn't do much. It just, you find the times and places to take a deep breath and then dive back in when you can. And that's all you can do. And if your community can support you, sometimes in silly, small ways, like friends bringing by dinner so you don't have to worry about it. That's so nice when that happens. Just little things like that.
Cindy, can you talk a little bit about, you know, from a managerial perspective, how do you work with staff who are encountering these challenges?
Sure. Well, again, going back to listening, making sure that I'm providing that support, letting staff know they can reach out to me. I am here for them. Empathizing, trying to understand what it felt like in that moment for them. De-escalating, helping them see there is a way forward. This was just a moment in time. It was an unfortunate interaction, but as a leader, I'm going to take it from here. As a leader, I'm going to make sure that we do what we can so that everyone has equal access to training and resources. In that moment, the staff, essentially, they're the representative of the library. They need to know what we stand for, what our values are. In providing them with that information, they know that they have that support, even if a leader isn't standing right next to them. In that moment, they need to just think about themselves, breathe, do what they can to get through it. And if that means removing themselves from the interaction, I always encourage everyone to do that. Have a buddy system, have someone who can tap you out. They can switch with you. You can go on a break. And even if that isn't possible, if at any time staff feel like they are not in a safe space, they can remove themselves. There's a time for customer service and there's a time for safety. And when those two seem like there isn't a safe overlap, decisions need to be made. Of course, it depends on the space. It depends on how many colleagues are there with you and other factors. But it's so important that everyone has the support that they need. I'm a warrior librarian. That's self-proclaimed, but I also went to Wayne State and we are the warriors. And so it's so important that I continue to educate myself. I'm a lifelong learner. So I always want to gain insight as to others' perspectives. I try to wrap my mind around where they're coming from when there's challenging information, when they're upset, when they're offended. Should I be offended by their offense? I don't know. It depends on the situation. You know, we all have different moods and emotions, but in the workplace, how do we represent in this trust profession? We shouldn't have to sacrifice who we are as people in order to accomplish that goal. Again, the mission of the library, equal and open access for everyone.
The ability to have a manager supporting you after that kind of an interaction is so important. There was a wonderful presentation. I think that they I'll see if we can add this to the material that we send in the email afterwards. But at ALA in DC this summer, there was a wonderful presentation from the Urban Libraries Association, I think it was, about stress that urban librarians take on, and they found that having the ability to decompress, to have a manager say you did it right, you did everything that you could in that moment as soon as possible, can tremendously alleviate the stress that librarians feel, not just about censorship issues, but about, any of the myriad stresses that librarians and, frontline library staff encounter. And I hope all of the attendees understand that when we talk about librarians here, we are talking about all library staff members, because we do acknowledge that everybody who's working in a library is impacted by this. Shelley, did you have anything to add on this topic?
Yeah, I think for me, the burnout is realizing that these book challenges represent a large and what feels like a growing segment of our American population. They don't feel like an isolated parent or an isolated community member. It feels like this ground swelling of that. I feel like our social standards are moving backwards. And so that sometimes is hard for me, because it doesn't feel like it's about an individual situation. So I would second what Gavin was mentioning. Therapy is definitely helpful, just to have someone talk through things. Sometimes it's nice to have a therapist that's not a librarian, just they give you an alternate perspective and help keep things really in perspective. I had a therapist tell me, maybe you aren't talking about book talking every single one of these books right now, but you have them on the shelf, and every small step is a small step that a kid is going to appreciate. So just move forward and just keep going, and small steps. And sometimes the small steps don't feel like they're important enough, and that can get frustrating for me, but that was reassuring that as long as I'm trying to move in the right direction. And then I think school librarians, for me, I'm one person with 2,000 students, and it can feel really lonely. There's no one there. I love what Cindy is talking about, that you have a manager that you debrief with right away. I don't ever feel like I have that. So to try, and not even every school librarian in my district has the same sort of attitude that I have. So sometimes you don't even know if you're is this colleague one that is a safe space or not. So I created a volunteer censorship support group in the elementary, middle school, and high school librarians in my district, where we basically are saying we're each other's safe space, and we can share articles or just touch base with one another and feel like it's a safe place to do that. And that's been really useful for me emotionally too. We haven't had to rely on it really heavily yet, but I think just knowing that it's there, and just being able to say hey, I saw this article in the New York Times, and just send it to them. It just feels like there's somebody I can turn to if something happens.
Yeah, some people in the Q&A have been asking about your group when you mentioned it earlier, and I would highly encourage anyone who doesn't feel like they have that in their own workplace to connect with colleagues and build a personal learning community for yourself that feels supportive. So going off on that topic, so being on a panel like this today, even those of you who are attending this webinar or watching it at another time, you're contemplating the issue of censorship takes time, it takes energy, it can be really draining, but we're all here today. Our panelists, you guys have all been working diligently with this issue for quite a while now, instead of backing away from it, which I think is really admirable and hard. And I want to acknowledge that that is a difficult thing to do. But how has diving deeper into this work impacted your own emotional reserves and your energy for the work or your professional satisfaction? And Cindy, can you start that off?
Sure.
You said you're a lifelong advocate.
I am. My slogans can't stop, won't stop. So I'm someone who gets energized when I hear that someone's struggling. How can I help? I'm someone who I want to show up, I want to support, I want to advocate, I want to help them build their reserve, take the time they need to process, and make sure that they have a plan moving forward. So a lot of the work that I do with the Freedom to Read Foundation is supportive, is creating advocacy and awareness. Every time we hear about another librarian who needs help, who's contacting the hotline, who's saying they need support with challenges. To me, that's not taking a step back. That propels us forward, because that is our work. We are here to make sure that everyone has equal access to accurate information. While it's unfortunate, it's a part of this current climate. How we move together is together. We need to have supports in place, and whether you are in a small system, in a small area, or you're part of a larger system, the impact is the same. In that moment, you need support, and how do you move forward? So it's so important that we know what resources are available and that we're sharing that. And I know not everyone has, the outgoing personality who stands up to challenges and says, well, I appreciate hearing from you. Have you considered that there are other perspectives here that need to be a part of this community? There are different ways that we go about responding to these things, but always following our process. Everything happens at the policy level. And so in my work, that's really what I want to make sure that we're doing as a library, is making sure that we have equitable policies in place that help everyone use their library successfully. So when you're looking at your collection development policy, when you're looking at materials reconsideration, making sure that everything is accessible, because when you put people back in power, they don't feel as helpless. I hear these challenges as someone feeling like, oh, they're out of solutions, and so now they're going to come to the library and they're going to share their feedback. Well, that's what we're here for. The good, the bad, and the indifferent. We want to hear all of that. But as staff, we need to make sure that we know that there is help out there, even if it's not currently in your system. And so, asking what the role of the library is, that's what we're here for. But this is the fundamental core belief. This is something that, again, I say censorship isn't negotiable. We really need to make sure that everyone has equal access from the staff side so that we can stand together in these times. And when you hear of challenge in the neighboring community, and that brings a certain amount of anxiety for some folks, just know that you're not alone and that there is a system in place. Someone will help you.
I'd really like to build on that because one of the things that I very firmly believe, we can't do this alone. We have to stand together. And I really encourage anyone who is facing a challenge to reach out for that support wherever you can. I make myself available. I don't care where you are. You can email me at my name, gavin.downing@gmail.com. You can email me if you are facing a challenge and need support. I will come up. I will help whoever is in need. And that's what energizes me, is making sure if you had asked me a year ago, my plans, it was to stay just at this middle school library until I retire and just keep doing my thing. This has lit a fire in me that I never expected. It's why I ran for the intellectual freedom section for Washington Library Association. It's why I'm hoping to really fight back, because these things hurt my students, and that really enrages me. And so I don't want to let that happen. I'm not going to stand by. I'm not going to just be a passive bystander on that. And so I truly believe you make the world better just in what your sphere of influence is, whatever you can do in your sphere of influence. And so with that, this is my sphere of influence. I'm going to use it. And if we can connect with each other, that just makes that sphere bigger.
Shelley, that was so great. And I do appreciate that. And I'm so grateful that we have such a nice attendance here today to bring this sphere of influence together. So Shelley, can you add on about how this has changed you as a professional?
For me, I think it's been this amazing world to connect to librarians beyond my individual district. I'm starting to develop a sense that there is maybe an imaginary different set of standards that exist for public librarians and school librarians, that like, oh, well, these items are fine for a public library or a YA section in a public library, but not a school library. That we've been maybe enculturated to believe that a school library has some higher level of protection that we're supposed to be offering students, as if restricting information is ever a protective act that you can take. But I think that there maybe is this unspoken acceptance that there are two different sets of standards for these libraries. And I finally said to my library director this fall, if a book is appropriate for the teen section at the public library, why would it be inappropriate for mine? And if it's if it's bad for kids, why are you letting it be anywhere? That doesn't make sense. It either has to be it's fine or it's not fine, this double standard. So I think when you're in just an exclusively school librarian atmosphere all the time, at least for me, it's easy to fall into those ways of thinking like, oh, right, I do kind of protect the kids. Like, of course, that's not exactly right. And you just don't have a challenge to that. And of course, I think our administration, encourages that atmosphere because they don't want to have challenges. And so you're just kind of the frog in hot water, and you don't realize just how far down the path of maybe self-censorship you've gone. Because it's happening slowly and it's quite acceptable. There's a librarian in my district that apparently set an elementary librarian who's weeded every book that features hand-holding. She thinks that's not appropriate. And she felt that this was fine to say out loud in a meeting of librarians. That's a sign that the culture of this library group is probably not one that fully embraces intellectual freedom. So I think for me to be able to connect outside and be in ALA and make those connections with public librarians and academic librarians and, Booklist and people who have a different perspective, it reminds me that when my administrator said, is there no line you won't cross? It made me feel like, oh my gosh, am I doing a bad job? And ALA and all the outside influences help to remind me that I'm not, but that can be just a scary thing. So I think to start to talk about the culture, maybe largely of what we accept as a school role versus a public role needs to be talked about more. So the engagement with that has helped me. And when I realized like I've gone farther away from my core beliefs than I wanted to, and I didn't even know I was doing it. So that has really like fired me up and brought me back to, I think, more what I have always wanted to stand for. I would also just say, I realized that talking about sex is super awkward. So, and that's most of the books that would face objection in my district at this point are definitely sex related. So I've started working with a sex therapist to learn how to get comfortable talking about these things. Because when you're not comfortable talking about something, and then you imagine an angry community member coming in, that can feel, when I imagined it, I was like, I don't really know how to talk about these things. And that's been useful to hear that there are developmental, like there's research on these topics. It doesn't just have to be my opinion and their opinion. Like we can go back to the fields of psychology and sociology and demonstrate that our students need access to these things. This is a public health concern, just the way, heart attacks and diabetes are. So having that, like an actual professional in the field to talk about, that's also really built my confidence. So that might be something for people to think about. It sounds really weird, but I said to my group, like, I think we need to have a sex therapist come and talk to school librarians. And they all were horrified, but I think it would be useful to make us feel like we know how to talk about this. And it isn't just that I'm a pedophile, which is what we all fear. I mean, this is the fear that I think we all have. So just connecting to the world outside of our individual environment has been useful for me.
I think that's so important to remember that as librarians, we're used to being the people who have the answers. But when we need a security consult on our library building. We don't just do it ourselves. We bring in people who are security experts. When we have a technical problem, we bring in technical experts. And I think that dealing with topics like this, we are not always the experts on these things. This is not something that we studied in our library training necessarily. And I think that it's really important when we run into these difficulties that we remember that there are other experts out there that if a patron came to us with this question, we would direct them to that expert. And sometimes we need to direct ourselves as well. Whether it's looking to the Office of Intellectual Freedom, the Freedom to Read Foundation, an outside therapist, a sex therapist, a doctor. I think that medical professionals can be useful in understanding these issues that we're dealing with as well. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I think it's a topic that, we all need to figure out what help we need, how to identify what is that help that each of us needs, and where to find those answers. Something I want to talk about now is something that, and I'm so unfortunately only have about 10 minutes left, but this is something that's coming up in the chat frequently, and I know that it's something that has impacted almost all of us, and that's the issue of quiet censorship, of challenges that come from within our own work environment, challenges that aren't formal but are hinted at or requested, or sometimes they even have the weight of, well, I'm your boss, and is this really what you want to have showing up in your evaluation, which is really scary and really difficult for a lot of librarians that are dealing with this. What advice do each of you have for librarians who are dealing with invisible challenges, quiet challenges, these kinds of insidious methods that are happening? I think increasingly, I think that what's happening too is the town next door is having a big issue and you don't want to follow in their footsteps. So maybe nothing has even happened in your community, but you're facing these same concerns. Cindy, can you start us off with this one?
Sure. So, when you go for your missing list and it's time to reorder, order 2 copies, make sure you have a backup, do what you can to make sure that everyone has access to those materials, because clearly if the item's missing, someone had a need to access that information. Now, when we're looking at how materials mysteriously, are removed from the collection from the public, that's what we can assume. When it's internal, everyone needs to have a collection development policy and it needs to be followed. So making sure that all staff know what that looks like, and especially making sure that leadership knows. We're seeing some problematic times with boards and board leaders not being committed to the mission of the library, not upholding the Bill of Rights, not caring about equal access. And that really shouldn't be an option. So it's so important that everyone is aware of what the policy is, that they're following the process, and that together we will make sure that if an item is needed and it's being requested, that we provide access, whether that's through our collection, through a digital title, or through interlibrary loan. It's just that simple. Make sure we get books in the hands of readers.
Gavin, your situation was exactly this. It was internal, and it was somebody not wanting to follow the policy. What advice do you have for someone who finds themselves in your situation?
It comes back to what I was saying earlier. Do what you can within your environment. And I would encourage you to be bold, be courageous, be willing to stand up for your students or your patrons or whoever it is that you're servicing. They deserve your best. Okay. And if it's outside your comfort zone to stand up, I'd strongly consider doing that. I'd encourage you to do that, but get that support, get the people who can stand with you as well. And if you need to talk to a therapist or a sex therapist to talk about the comfort, to increase your comfort with it, go for that. Because if you don't stand up for it, no one else will, and that patron will not be served. and that patron deserves to be served. It may mean being uncomfortable. It may mean facing something that you really don't want to face. I really didn't want to face those 6 months, but at the end of it, when I knew I was going to another school, when it was Pride Month, it was June, a young man came up to me quietly and he said, Mr. Downing, I just wanted to thank you for always having such great books in your library. He put that emphasis there. And because we didn't talk about it at the school, but everyone knew it was happening. And he looked around to make sure no one was looking. He raised his fist and he said, "Happy Pride." And in that moment, he felt comfortable enough with me to open up to me in that way. That made all of it worthwhile for that kid in that moment.
That's so great. I'm so glad you were there for him.
Well, and I would just add to know your policies. When there was some discussion about All Boys Aren't Blue, that was in a 7th grade classroom library. So this was not the school library, but it was in the teacher's collection. It was a big blow up in my district in the fall, a year ago in the fall. And we pulled out our policies and we realized in reading both our reconsideration policy and our selection policy that a lot of us were operating under a verbal explanation of what our policies were that didn't actually match up with the written guidelines. And the verbal policies we'd been told were actually, I think in the selection policy, probably more restrictive than the actual written selection policy, but we always just kind of like what's passed down from the librarian before you and your friends. And so really, if you haven't pulled out your policy in a while and looked at it, I would pull it out. I have mine bookmarked on my desktop so I can reference it frequently. So when we're talking about my collection development, I will reference it just to make sure I'm completely accurate. I also personally feel that my selection policy is outdated. So I am working trying to get other librarians in my district fired up about that to get an updated selection policy and an updated reconsideration policy. Our reconsideration policy allows for a book to be pulled if an administrator and the librarian will just simply agree to it. And that's part of the policy. I would like to have that removed, where if anybody wants to follow the process, that's fine. But I think it should always be public, because I think when one angry community member is trying to pull something, it doesn't allow the community and that administrator who has no background in library and so doesn't honestly know what they're doing. I'm not necessarily faulting them. Their job is to like keep things quiet. I understand that. So they're just like, oh, how do we make this go away? And they don't understand the implications of what they're doing necessarily, but it also doesn't give the community a chance to know that these things are happening. And so the community cannot generate any kind of support for that title. So you only hear the parent who's angry. You don't hear the 10 who want their student to have access to this title. So I've made a commitment to my fellow librarians that if there's ever a book challenge, I don't care what it is, I will stand by them. I will be the second person to say, we're not taking it, file a formal complaint, like let's go there. And so I think if we can specifically say to each other, like, I will support you in that challenge, you don't let your principal be the one for whatever reason to just push you into agreeing to this. Because I do think that the silent challenges, and when they're a part of your policy, that's a really hard thing to stand up to an administrator for. And again, you're one person and that can feel really scary.
Yeah, definitely. So we are unfortunately rapidly running out of time. So I'm going to ask 2 questions together, and if you can give a concise answer, and then we will move on. I just also want to mention that we are getting a lot of questions in the Q&A. Please don't stop asking questions in the Q&A. We're going to pass those on to all of our panelists. So if there are things that we haven't covered yet, please do drop a question in the Q&A. So I'd like to conclude on a somewhat positive note, because the idea of persevering does take positive energy. We'd like to encourage all of you to keep fighting this fight. It's so important. So have there been any, did you find support or or camaraderie in surprising places is the first part of the question throughout this process. And if you can share a book that has brought you joy lately as a little bit of an escapist moment that people can go back to if they need a moment. Shelley, can you start?
So mine is a funny one. I have a family that doesn't talk about sex ever, like no sex ed, no talks from my mom or my dad. But my mom fell last fall and broke her hip. And so she was living with us at the time when All Boys Aren't Blue was blowing up in my district. And so I'd come home super frustrated. And so for the first time ever, I was having all these talks about like what was happening at school. And she happened to be living with me. So she was hearing all of it. And she has become the biggest advocate for LGBTQ sexually detailed books in school libraries that you would ever meet. She's 84. This is something totally different. And it's super awesome. So that's been really fun. She bookmarks articles for me. And yeah, she's very passionate. So that's like totally not what I would have ever thought. And then I just read this week, Cheeky, a memoir, which is like a head to toe. It's an artist who does a memoir, but she connects it to paintings of her body. And it's all about like female body acceptance and empowerment, but it's also very funny. I just loved it. So that's a great one.
Thank you. Gavin, how about you?
The Massage Envy, I go to the people there offered to let me know anytime there were openings so that I could come in just because I live very close to there. I didn't need to take them up on it too much, but it was very nice to just have that support. Pardon me. As for a book, I just read Patricia Jackson's Forging a Nightmare, a fun Black urban fantasy book that I really enjoyed. Pardon me. Yeah, that would be the one that I enjoy.
Thank you. Cindy, can you close this out for us?
Sure. Well, nothing surprising really, but of course, the Missouri Library Association is providing a lot of support to librarians right now, and we hope you'll join us. The Secretary of State has taken a position requesting an administrative rule that would allow the public to make decisions about library collections. Quite problematic, and who knows what they would remove. I really enjoyed a graphic novel, Thunderous, this past week by Mandy Smoker and Natalie Peters. And I'm a big mystery thriller fan, so I love Jennifer McMahon and I escape often. I recently read The Invited, and I highly recommend it if you like to stay up at night being creeped out.
And if you don't like creeped out, but you like food in your books, like recipes, not actual pieces of food, which we've probably seen in the book drop here and there. Love and Saffron was a delightful epistolary novel that I recently read. It's all about forging a friendship over food, which was really sweet. Thank you all so very much. I wish we could keep talking, but we'll keep talking in email. The Q&A is bringing up some wonderful questions, and we will share all of those with the panelists and hopefully get resources and support to everybody who needs it. So thank you so much for Cindy, Shelley, and Gavin for sharing your experiences today. We are so appreciative of everything you're doing to protect the freedom to read. Thank you so much for your service to librarianship and to readers, and especially to young readers everywhere. As a reminder, all of the questions that we did not get to will be passed along to our panelists so they can follow up through email. Additionally, all registrants will receive a copy of this video, a recording of this that you can watch later, a certificate of completion. All of this is going to be in a follow-up email tomorrow. You can email webinars@booklistonline.com if you have any questions. As we mentioned earlier in the program, you can visit Unite Against Book Bans to join the fight against censorship. Scan this QR code on the screen to get to our website for tons of resources that will help you combat censorship at the community, state, and national level. And this is a resource for community members as well as library staff workers. If you want great books like the ones discussed today to reach your patrons directly, then be sure you have the Booklist Reader on your shelves. Share Booklist Reader digitally or deliver Booklist's unparalleled recommendations in print. Learn more about it at the website listed here. Check out our website for more information about ordering your copies now. We will be going to print in January. You can support all of these books and authors that are currently under threat from challenges through collection development. If you or your staff need to learn collection development from the ground up, or you just want to refresh your skills in this environment, check out the upcoming collection development crash course hosted by our ALA colleagues in e-learning. You can find more information at elearning.ala.org. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. One final thanks to our panelists, Cindy, Shelley, and Gavin, and a huge thank you to all of you who are here today, librarians, library workers, educators, and readers for your hard work and efforts to support the freedom to read. This concludes today's webinar.